Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to this afternoon's PROFS State Budget Forum. This year, we're pleased to partner with ASPRO, the Academic Staff Public Representation Organization, and the Follette School of Public Affairs. The forum is a chance to hear from individuals who are knowledgeable about the biennial budget process, and will give attendees a chance to ask them questions about the process and the budget priorities as they've been enunciated in the governor's budget and the Joint Finance Committee's work with that proposal. This is our 7th forum since 2009. My name is Mike Bernard Donalds, and I'm the president of PROFS. I'd like to thank our panelists, Jason Stein from the Wisconsin Policy Forum, State Senator John Erpenbach, and State Senator Dale Kooyenga for taking the time to join us today. And thanks to Susan Yackee from the Follette School for moderating our panel. Thanks to Brittany Mitchell of the Follette School for providing excellent technical assistance, and to Michelle Felber and Jack O'Meara for putting the forum together. PROFS, the public representation organization of the Faculty Senate, was formed more than 40 years ago to provide a voice for UW-Madison faculty in the legislative process. While much has changed since the 1970s, the need for PROFS is needed now more than ever. PROFS is funded solely by voluntary contributions, so please consider joining if you're not already a member. Let me turn it over now to Jenny Dahlberg from ASPRO, after which I'll introduce our moderator.
Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Jenny Dahlberg, and as Mike alluded to, I am the current president of the Academic Staff Professionals Representation Organization that represents academic staff who are employed across all UW system. It's a voluntary membership-based lobbying organization that helps to support the voices of academic staff who represent a very large contingent of our employees, both at Madison and across the system, who support the educational missions of our various campuses through advising, instruction, research, and service. We're happy to partner with PROFS and La Follette today to discuss the budget priorities. And if you are an academic staff member and you are not currently a member of ASPRO, I would encourage you to consider joining. The membership fee is very nominal. It helps to support our lobbyist, who can then advocate on behalf of all academic staff at both the campus levels, the Board of Regents levels, as well as the state level. The website is just aspro.net. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Michael. We're happy that you're here to join us today.
So let me now introduce Susan Yackee, the director of the La Follette School of Public Affairs. Professor Yackee is the Collins Bascom Professor of Public Affairs and Political Science, whose publications include work on US policymaking, public management, regulation, administrative law, and interest group politics. Before becoming an award-winning scholar, she worked as a legislative research assistant in the US Senate. She's the recipient of the Herbert A. Simon Career Contribution Award, the highest award in political science for the study of bureaucracy and public administration. She's an elected member of the Public Management Research Association and the recipient of a $500,000 Innovative Regulatory Sciences Award from the Borough's Wellcome Fund. She's also a gifted administrator, now serving for the second time as the La Follette School Director, and I had the privilege of working with her as a fellow in the Office of the Provost. Let me turn it over to Susan.
Thank you, Michael, for that very kind introduction. So welcome, everybody. Again, I'm Susan Yackee. I'm the director of the La Follette School of Public Affairs, and I'm just delighted to be moderating our event tonight. Before moving forward, I know that many of you already know that the La Follette School is the home for public policy research and teaching on UW-Madison's campus, but you might not know that the school is experiencing a lot of growth right now, almost doubling the size of our faculty and over tripling the number of students that we serve, all within the last year or so. It's a really exciting time for the school. And we're particularly excited about being able to take a larger convening role on important public policy topics in our state, like today's campus state budget forum. Joining me today are Jason Stein, John Erpenbach, and Dale Kooyenga. I want to introduce each of these folks in turn. Jason Stein is the research director of the Wisconsin Policy Forum, where his focus is on state and local government. He has a master's degree in journalism from UW-Madison and worked as a Capitol reporter for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and the Wisconsin State Journal before joining the Wisconsin Policy Forum. State Senator John Erpenbach has represented the 27th State Senate District since 1999. His district includes portions of 5 counties in south central Wisconsin, including western Dane County. Senator Erpenbach worked as a radio personality before working in the state Senate and in the state assembly as a communications professional. State Senator Dale Kooyenga was elected to the state assembly in 2010 and the state Senate in 2018. He represents several western suburbs in Milwaukee, including Brookfield and Elm Grove. Senator Kooyenga is a certified public accountant. He's also an Iraqi war veteran, and he continues to serve our country in the U.S. Army Reserves. Welcome, panel. So I've asked each of our panelists to kind of pull together 2 or 3 minutes of background information to kick off our state budget forum today. And I'm going to begin with Jason Stein. Jason, if you can begin, and then I'm going to ask Senators Erpenbach and Kooyenga to add their thoughts when Jason concludes. Welcome.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to all the sponsors and to the audience. You know, really quickly, if you look at where we were a year ago, the irony has been, I think, the economy and the state budget have held up better, much better, I think, than expected. On the public health side, I think a lot of the impacts have been worse than we feared, but on the budget side, been somewhat better. The UW system in particular was not in a particularly strong position compared to the past 20 years when we went into this crisis. There were a lot of concerns about the UW, starting with there was $86 million in lapses that were being required. You just think of those as spending cuts of discretionary dollars. There were the enrollment losses, which did not turn out to be as bad, I think, as we maybe feared, maybe 2% in the fall, but are still, you know, at some campuses really significant. The last we've heard from the UW system is that they've tallied their losses at $534 million. I haven't independently checked that number, but that's what they've said. On the good side, we're seeing more than $1 billion in federal money for higher education come through the 3 rounds of stimulus. Now, someone might say, oh, geez, so what's the problem? The thing to remember is that roughly half of that money goes to students for, low-income students, student financial aid, and there's, certain, in addition, that money is for all colleges and universities in the state, not just the UW system. So that's important to remember. I'll give you just, I'm going to go probably more like 4 minutes, and I apologize, but I'll give you a couple slides here. So first, come on, there we go. All right, so here's taxes. What you can see is that in Wisconsin, less than 1% growth in our taxes in 2020, not great, but when you look at all states nationally, they lost 2.5%. So you can see that it wasn't great, but it could have been a lot worse, and it was a lot worse for your average bear. Then the big help has been state and local governments in Wisconsin are receiving at least, we've tallied it, $20 billion in stimulus dollars through the CARES Act, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, and the American Rescue Plan Act. That's roughly double what the state got from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in a decade ago. Just now, and then so here you can see the specific dollars for education that are within those 3 bills. The gray is the higher education emergency relief funds. You can see how they've grown from the CARES Act and got progressively bigger through ARPA. Okay, I'll stop sharing. And then, just looking at what's in the state budget for UW, the governor put in a $190 billion increase in state tax funding. Of the capital budget, the overall capital budget is $2.2 billion of new projects being greenlighted or enumerated. About half of that is for UW projects. There's other measures. There's the tuition promise, operating borrowing, which there's not as much borrowing authority for UW as most universities nationally. But a lot of that, I think, is going to come out, and some of it this week, like the borrowing and the tuition promise already did come out. So that's my spiel. I'll turn it over to other people. Thank you for giving me 4 minutes.
Senator Erpenbach.
Thank you, Susan, and good afternoon to everybody. And I don't have any slides. You didn't tell us we could have slides. So I've got paper and I'll just kind of go like this. Yeah, anyway. So we started the Joint Committee on Finance process yesterday with the governor's budget. And essentially the first thing we did yesterday with the budget was get rid of about 390 items or so in the budget. And some of them were UW related. But the good news coming out of that for the system is the fact that obviously the UW system budget remains open, meaning Finance Committee members will visit that at a certain time and date when the majority party that controls finance will come to whatever resolution they come to when it comes to funding the system as a whole. The capital budget obviously is something that I'm keeping a pretty close eye on. I know a lot of the buildings were built in the 50s through the 70s. And you certainly have some buildings falling apart. You certainly have some buildings that once the renovation started, for example, it was discovered that you should just tear the whole thing down. So there are projects all over our campuses that certainly do need attention and certainly need to be completed, hopefully this budget cycle. And I really do hope that happens. That being said, the overall grand scheme of things is I believe Wisconsin is only as strong as the UW system is. I mean, it is the economic driver in this state, in every region of the state. And it's important to continue to invest as best as we possibly can to make sure we keep the doors open, we keep tuition affordable, and if it's gonna be frozen, we make sure that it's funded. And we have to realize that our economy is going to be changing over the next couple of decades, and the UW system as a whole is going to be in the forefront of that, making sure that we have students who turn into workers who stay in Wisconsin, pay taxes, and we keep things going. And one more thing I want to talk about here is I'm also on the Universities Committee, and some of you may have read or heard that a committee report was released by the committee chairman as far as what his vision is for the UW system moving forward. And I want to make this really, really clear. We didn't have any input. We being the minority members on the committee had no input on that report. We had no idea the report was coming. Voted against it today and asked for my name to be removed from it. So if you have any questions about why it's there, what came about, I really can't tell you because we were never given a heads up by the committee chairman that he was going to produce a report. So with that, I'll wrap it up and send it back to you, Susan.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Kooyenga.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And it's an honor to be on the panel with Jason. It's good to see you. I don't always, as imagine as a public official, have like a great amount of affinity for all journalists. But Jason was always an exception to that, who I always felt called balls and strikes as they were thrown, and consistently was just a professional. And so just working with Jason more on a day-to-day basis, but happy to see him on the panel and really excited the work he's doing now in his current role. And Senator Erpenbach I don't often agree, but we have those moments. I find him funny. Most of the time we have the same sort of sense of dry humor, even though he's not a CPA. He has the humor of a CPA. And I do, in all seriousness, think he cares. And I think that the first step of working with someone is to know they care, and he's definitely someone who cares. So it's an honor to be with you guys on this panel, and thanks for having me. I don't know, there's all sorts of different directions I could go. I could go quantitative or qualitative. I'll kind of do like a mix of both. As Senator Erpenbach pointed out, I think there was semi-good news in yesterday's action, was that the committee adopted into the base, and I won't try to talk too much inside baseball, but essentially the governor did what, and this is what they call lapses. I don't know who said lapses was like the word politicians should use. Most people will call those cuts. So a lapse is a cut. And what the committee did in some areas was make the governor's lapses permanent adjustments to the base. And the committee did not do that for the University of Wisconsin system. I am going above and beyond. And one of the things I want to stress today, and I encourage you to engage, is that the largest lapses in the last decade are currently in this budget. The governor lapsed over $85 million. The governor has the power today, this afternoon, to reverse those lapses, which would immediately give $86 million back to the University of Wisconsin at his sole discretion. I would like to see the governor do that immediately. The state of Wisconsin has record revenue. We've never had this much revenue. There's billions in federal funds. We are in a very, very healthy financial position. And I would like to see the governor today reverse those lapses and get that money to the university. Why? I mean, if you look at economics, there's two ways you grow an economy, and that is population growth. And America and Wisconsin in particular, America's not doing good on that. And Wisconsin in particular is on the bottom half of that. And then there's productivity. And so I feel like University of Wisconsin is on that productivity front. It could also help retain and bring here talent, which is on the growth front. So, we're in a knowledge economy, and I think that knowledge economy, the UW system, has a lot to do with it. So I've worked with the University of Wisconsin system closely, particularly the past year, with some Department of Defense stuff I'm doing. And I can tell you that just was impressed before and even more impressed now with the professionalism and the value that they have to offer. And so I'll be an advocate. I mean, I think that the majority of what is in the proposed budget for UW makes sense. I mean, some of that stuff I think is just like has to be done. I mean, there's some stuff on the building maintenance, which is just like, hey, if you build a building, you got to maintain the building. And other things as far as, just if you are, some people in my party pride themselves on being businessmen. Well, if you have incredibly demand for a product like an engineering school, like why would you not go to market with access capacity or more capacity to meet that demand? So I'm really hoping that we could get to some healthy, good investments for Wisconsin through the UW system through some of those proposals. Nursing is another one. And so I get it. I think this is all tied together, and looking forward to seeing what we could do in the next month and a half to, have a strong foundation for the next year at UW. But in the interim, I'm really hoping the governor reverses those lapses and we could start today with the resources we need.
So some great opening comments. I know our audience is going to be eager to ask some questions to this panel. So if you have questions, please do put them in the chat. Those are going to get fed to me, and I can relay them to our audience, our panelists as well. So I want to get started with a question. No surprise that our questions that came in advance are about campus for this campus state budget forum. I want to start with Senator Kooyenga. And then ask the same question to Senator Erpenbach and Jason Stein. So Senator Kooyenga, you started to answer this question already, but from your vantage point, what are the 2 or 3 really important items that are likely to be in this year's 2-year state budget as they relate to UW-Madison?
Yeah, that's really hard. I mean, because there's a lot of stuff in there that's to point out, and it's really I'm gonna have a hard thing now. I'm gonna get like all the chancellors would be like, you didn't choose my project. So that's a tough question, but let me just throw some ideas. One of them I'll actually kind of do a curveball, and that is that the tuition freeze is going, I'm pretty sure it's going to be lifted. And the reason it's going to be lifted, I don't think is because of any legislative action. The tuition freeze is to run out statutorily this June or July. And so with the absence of additional legislation, that is off. And I support, I mean, I wish there were some parameters on there a little bit, but I support that. I think it's time it's been a decade now. I think that the value of tuition and the results of what the product you get for that tuition are at a very, very good, reasonable value-added price. And the consequences of continuing a tuition freeze indefinitely is having people that will make less money over their career because they do not have a college education, subsidizing those that will make more money over their career with a college education. So I think you need to have some equity in your education. We've got to have financial aid and other things to make it affordable. But I think it's one of the big items out there. And then I know I'm over on time already, so I'll just throw 2 others out there. I think the engineering school at UW is a big thing. I think the water concept is something that's consistent with the Wisconsin idea, and it's something that we have to offer the country on that emerging issue that needs a lot of help. And I think it's a place that if you, one more divergence, then I'll be done. It's always amazing to me. I'm a big tax policy guy. I love tax policy. I'm a big, reasonable regulation guy. But if you look at, let's say Silicon Valley or New York City, both those places have high taxes and high regulation, but they're still the places you go if you're in finance or if you're in, IT. Why? Because just as powerful sometimes as reasonable regulation and a tax environment is the power of clusters, right? The clustering power. And so I think what we need to do is invest in those places where Wisconsin can be a cluster in a certain industry and then the international leader on that, like water. So sorry to be long-winded, a lot to talk about. I'll stop.
Senator Erpenbach.
What do I think is going to be in there? Whatever the Republicans want in the end, that's what it's going to come down to. I can tell you what I would like to see in there. What I would like to see in there, if the freeze does in fact go forward, and I agree with Dale, it may not, and if it doesn't, I think that's a good thing. But if it does, we have to make sure that the freeze is paid for. We just cannot, can no longer, once in a while, say, well, we can just freeze costs. Costs go up every year. We know that. And the UW system as a whole has done a really good job trying to deal with the freeze when it hasn't been funded in the past. So I hope that that's in there. Madison specific, obviously the capital projects are extremely important in order to not only attract students, obviously, but also to attract faculty as best as we can. I don't want to see any micromanaging of the UW in the budget at all, which occasionally Dale's not one of them, but some legislators like to micromanage the system because they've gone to school, so they know how to run a school, apparently. So I hopefully we don't see any micromanaging in there at all. And also the water initiative, obviously, I think is really important. I talked about emerging economies that could be out there. This could certainly lead to an emerging economy, not only here in the state, but I think throughout the nation if we do this right. So those are some things that I would like to see in there. Whether or not they're going to be in there, we'll try, but we'll see.
Jason, how about from your perspective, what are some 2 or 3 things, maybe based on your research, that you could share with this group that you think ought to be in that next 2-year budget?
I'll talk about some of the things that rise to the top of the agenda. My little spiel for those who don't know is we don't advocate. And so we're not selling anything to you today from the policy forum, but Dale mentioned the engineering building. That's a huge one for UW-Madison. Also, the College of Letters and Sciences building project is another really big one. Another thing that it's not in the least bit sexy, but the university has a huge chunk of the deferred maintenance within state government. And, so it doesn't get anyone's attention until, sometimes a big chunk of concrete falls off a building like Van Hise. And then everyone says, oh, wow, that's a problem. And so, that's a really significant thing, even though you'll never hear anyone, it'll never lead a news story except in the wrong way. The tuition freeze that was mentioned earlier is a really significant thing. We can talk a little bit maybe later about the research that we did, but one thing that showed was that the tuition freeze has accomplished the goal that was set out for it, which is, if you look since 2013, which is the levels that we've been frozen in place at, nationally, 4-year public universities, the increase in tuition in Wisconsin is like 3rd lowest in the country. And it's really about the same for UW-Madison if you look at the UW-Madison peer group. And when you look at other universities like University of Washington, University of Florida, that held tuition lower over that time period, they got a big infusion of tax dollars that sort of bought down tuition. And, for the UW, that's not really been the case. They've gotten some tax dollars, but really they've done that internally. So the tuition freeze will be one to watch. It's worth remembering that before we had the tuition freeze, we had 2 years of a 5.5% per year limit on tuition. So, the legislature has all the options they want. I mean, they can pull the freeze off entirely, or they can put some kind of a cap on it. It's people that don't work with the legislature, the two senators know this, but the legislature can do lots and lots of things. They have a lot of authority. It's not unlimited, but it's pretty broad, especially when you're talking about something like a public university.
Quick alibi on the tuition freeze, and just like a thought to consider when you talk about backfilling it, is backfilling also means that the majority of Wisconsinites that do not have a college education are paying for the college education. And there's no reason that the guy swinging the hammer or the person working at the cash register has to subsidize my kid's college education. The Kooyenga family can pay for their college education, and the kids could pay for the college education with the increased wages they're going to earn. So instead of backfilling a tuition freeze, I would prefer to do financial aid to target that to low-income Wisconsinites or others trying to climb the economic ladder, as opposed to subsidizing everyone's tuition altogether. And I don't know if the legislature will do something or not. I think that the fear that the legislature can do something may be enough safeguards for the university system to figure out what is a reasonable tuition increase. And I also want to go back to like when the tuition freeze was put in place. Some of my Republican colleagues, I think, got a little bit away, and I was one of the guys that actually was a result of that. And that the problem then was a transparency issue, a disclosure issue that led to the tuition freeze, not necessarily that it was and those have been solved. I mean, the transparency issue has been solved. The cash balance is at a reasonable, justified level. So I think you guys just keep that in perspective. And yeah, the day has come. It's time to give more flexibility to university for that, and not have other people subsidize other people who are be making more money's education.
If I could
Universities
just chime in here real quick, Susan, and sorry, Jason. I agree with Dale to a point, and it's a short point. I think the entire state benefits from an education system that's in place, whether they choose to go there or not. I went to Oshkosh for like 20 minutes, but I enjoyed my time there. But at the same time, I benefit from a strong UW system, and the person swinging the hammer benefits from a strong UW system. And the idea that person swinging the hammer, their kids may someday, in fact, go to a strong public university system is really important. I agree. If we can target financial aid to people who need it, absolutely. You know, we've been talking about trying to do that forever. And occasionally we've been successful. But at the same time, as I said at the top, I think our state is only as strong as our system is, and the idea that somebody shouldn't help underwrite it because they don't see any benefit from it, I kind of disagree with that. I think everybody, regardless of your age, regardless of your income, regardless of your occupation, regardless of your lot in life, I think everybody benefits from it.
I agree, by the way, everyone benefits from the education as well. So I'm not arguing for like no state assistance. I'm just arguing that in a funny sense is I'm arguing that those with higher means can afford to pay for more of their education, and a tuition freeze doesn't allow that to happen.
Dale also mentioned the tuition balances, that sort of the buildup of tuition balances that were an impetus for the tuition freeze. In the last financial statements, those were down 60% since 2013. So, you know, people can disagree on whether or not it was a problem in the first place, but it's certainly, the situation has changed in part because of the freeze.
So I want to change our conversation just a little bit and focus on something odd about this 2-year budget biennium, and that is the expected federal dollars that are likely to come into the state as a result of the several COVID relief bills. So Senator Erpenbach, let's start with you this time. How do you see these one-time funds fitting in to state legislators' thinking on the budget, especially as it applies to potential support for higher ed?
It shouldn't be fit into our thinking. One has nothing to do with the other. The federal funding should be at the discretion of the UW system as far as where they see the biggest one-time need is. We can't use the federal funding to replace operational costs, for example. So I've been trying to get the word out that whether it's K-12 education, whoever is getting any federal funding, that doesn't have anything to do with the upcoming state budget that Dale and I are going to be working on. These are two totally, completely separate things. And again, one has nothing to do with the other. So as far as my thinking for the state budget, the federal funding doesn't come into play at all. It has nothing to do with the budget that the 21-23 budget that we're working on right now.
Jason, do you want to?
I know this question is into the budget in total or just the UW system, but I agree in part with Senator Erpenbach that it is definitely one-time money. So last thing you want to do with this money is to fund perpetual costs, right? The good use for one-time federal money is one-time cost. So in addition to the new revenue numbers, which we're waiting for in June, which happens every 2-year budget, another thing that the legislators are really waiting for right now is the Treasury Department guidance on what federal funds can be used for, which comes out in the next several weeks. And that will be huge because depending on how that guidance is written, that's where we could look is if we can make any sort of justification for using that for one-time expenses. And so we may be able to use some of that federal money to pay down some maintenance on the buildings. That is a big number. I don't know, but maybe some of the building costs themselves. But I think we'll be looking at what the Treasury Department says. And I think everyone will be looking at seeing how much of those one-time costs we could use with that federal money, because that would make financial sense.
That is the first thing that we have been humbly recommending, is that people look at what the funds are supposed to be used for. It does really vary, and we've already seen evolution on what the thinking is about what is and what isn't allowed. So that's really important. And then, we certainly 10 years ago, we did have an issue as a state where a lot of money got put into K-12, operations, essentially state aids as well as Medicaid. And then 2 years later, the state had difficulty sustaining those obligations. So it doesn't necessarily mean it would happen again this time. The economy may bounce back faster. The things that happened 10 years ago, we're not doomed to repeat those things, but it's certainly worth, I think, keeping in the back of our minds. And yes, thinking about how do we sort of put one-time money into one-time needs, maybe that's position us better for the future, is a way to, avoid Groundhog Day on that.
So we've had one question come in from a number of our audience members, and that's about some reluctance among some folks in the legislature about providing additional budgetary flexibilities, especially around borrowing for operational expenses to UW-Madison in particular. One audience member suggests that why isn't this occurring when, quote, all of our UW-Madison peers, end of quote, have these types of flexibilities. I'll start with you, State Senator Kooyenga.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually probably the wrong guy to ask that, because I actually support some additional flexibilities, maybe not all of them. But I think some of the line of credit requests and some of the flexibilities within the appropriations make sense. I mean, if you're already doing the appropriation, you're saying like, this is the parameters. I think we've come a long way as far as transparency and oversight the last decade. And I know those lack of flexibilities have been there for decades, like 30 years at least. So I think there's proper safeguards there to have more flexibilities, and I would support most of those.
Senator Erpenbach?
Yeah, I agree. I want there to be certainly more flexibility in the operation of the UW, and I don't know why. I'm sure there's a good reason, although I probably wouldn't necessarily agree with it, that governors don't want to give up, and it doesn't matter if it's Democratic governor or Republican governor, give the UW bonding authority. And you guys just go on your own and build your buildings and pay for them. And I know that's something that the UW's wanted for a long time. And again, we've had Democrats from both sides, governors from both sides of the aisle who have not granted that wish. But obviously, I'd like to see the system have more flexibility to just operate. You know, legislators, we know a little bit about a lot of stuff. Some of us focus in on particular issues. Mine's been healthcare. Dale's been basically anything, nuts and bolts, CPA, really exciting stuff. That, yeah, for Dale it is. So, like I said, we know a little bit about a lot of stuff, but I do know that there are some legislators who would love to get their hands, and not just Madison, but the system as a whole, and reshape it and do this, and we're going to close this campus, and we're going to move this over here, and eliminate that program here, and put it down there, and we don't want duplication. And I understand all that stuff, but the UW can figure that out, and the UW can become leaner when it needs to be. For the longest time, this is the last thing I want to say. For the longest time, and this is going back, I've been in office now, I don't know, 20 years or so. And the UW used to be this dinosaur that would just kind of plod along, and just plod and plod and plod. And with online courses being offered from other institutions, from curricula, from the need of educated workforce changing so rapidly, the system really stepped it up and became pretty nimble, and continues to become nimble whenever it possibly can. So the changes are there. And we just need to continue to make sure that we back our, when I say our, Wisconsin's public university system as best as we can.
Real quickly, actually go ahead. I'm sorry, I'll come back. Sorry.
Go for it, Editor.
No, I think what I was going to say was I'm probably getting too much in the weeds, but there's perverse incentives built in there that are to why both Republican and Democrats administrations will not give the flexibilities to UW. I don't know the exact percentage, maybe Jason knows it, but like, for example, when UW does bonding, DOA takes a percentage of their bonding as opposed to just allowing them to do their own bonding. So like what happens is that when the administration goes to give up that power is like, they're like, well, we don't want to give up cut our own budget, right? But like, why is DOA taking a cut of UW bonding? Like, they have like the best finance, money, banking experts in the state in the UW, and they go to like a bunch of political appointees at DOA to do like, they could do that, and DOA doesn't need to take a cut. But that's why like DOAs, Democrats and Republicans, are reluctant to give that authority. So this is just a lesson too that, especially in the executive branch, is that when you give the executive branch, once there's a nonpartisan statement, when you give the executive branch power, whether it be the federal or state level, you can never get that power back, because guess how you need to get the power back from the executive branch, minus a court ruling, is you have to ask the executive branch not to veto that change, right? So there's definitely like cases for flexibilities. I think that's a great one, is like the DOA should not be taking a cut of bonding from the UW system.
And I don't mean to interrupt. I'm going to be really quick, Jason. Actually, power from the executive office can be taken away. It's called a lame duck session, and we just went through that, where the incoming governor lost the ability to do a couple of things, so it can be taken away. But Dale's right. I mean, it's not like we're getting a better deal on bonding, like going to Costco and buying a whole bunch of toilet paper. The system can get just as good of a bonding rate, I think, as the state can. So again, it's a situation where Dale's right. I don't know why this is happening, and certainly governors don't want to give it up. But at the same time, I think it would make the UWs a much stronger system if they had the ability to bond on their own.
Well, we don't have a dog in that fight, but we looked at all other states in the country. Every other state in the country does have a higher education entity, a board or a university that is authorized to bond and that is rated by a bond rating agency. And, Wisconsin is the lone state that isn't. So we certainly do things differently.
That's great context, Jason. And I'm curious, I want to put this question to you first, Jason Stein. Through your research, which I know is comparing Wisconsin to other public universities in other states, what are some of maybe 2 or 3 of the big takeaways that you have found, particularly matters that haven't come up yet today, that we ought to be thinking about?
Well, a couple quick ones that have come up a little bit, but when you look at the state funding question and the tuition combined, higher education funding has definitely lagged in Wisconsin over the past 10, 20 years. So we've sort of, depending on how you measure it, fallen from being above average or middle of the pack to, toward the very bottom of the Midwest, or certainly below the national average over that time period on sort of per full-time student equivalent funding. Our enrollment declines have been worse. So our higher ed enrollment decline over the past decade, at least from 11 to 19, was about 13%. That's about double what you've seen nationally. We're not necessarily worse than the rest of the upper Midwest, which has just got some demographic challenges, but that's an issue. And then I think, to me, one of the things that we haven't talked about that I think is a real opportunity for our state is, we have capacity within our system to be serving more students. We have students within the state of Wisconsin that need opportunity, particularly students of color. And if we could do a better job of bringing those students into the world of higher education and then truly serving them and getting them to the finish line, we would have a better workforce. We'd have a better sort of system of higher education. There would be more students within it. And, we would also, I think, have a more equitable society. So that's something but the reality is right now, we had the largest completion gap between Black and white university students at four-year institutions when we looked at that. So we have this promise, I think, in the future, but, it's not going to happen unless we're really deliberate and thoughtful as a state. But we hope that we hope that we can get there over time. So.
I mean, to that point, I mean, the enrollment, full-time enrollment, FTEs from 2010, 2011 so today has dropped by 14,000 students. I mean, that's a small campus worth. So we need to, with a sense of urgency, and particularly among the minority community, commit ourselves as a state to increasing the numbers of particularly students of color from Milwaukee and Madison who are able to get into the university system off the bat and then complete. And I am with I know I sound like a broken record, and I know Senator Erpenbach knows where I'm going with this, but I'm one of those Republicans that keep telling my colleagues social injustice is not a word you should be embarrassed of. And the reason is because right now the social injustice right now is the fact that those schools of color are exponentially more likely to be closed than the schools of their white peers throughout the state. And what's going to happen is that you're going to see less representation from minorities in our state. You're going to see less students that are eligible for those enrollments in our state, and those numbers continue to decline if we don't get those schools open. And if there's not a Herculean effort, like a 1941, let's win this war effort, or a 1960s, let's get to the moon effort, there has to be a Herculean effort today, right now, to get these schools open and get these kids caught up and beyond that, so that every single student, no matter what school district or school that they attend in our state, have a shot of getting admitted and completing a UW system education.
Senator Erpenbach, do you want to reply?
Yeah, I do. Dale's right, schools do need to be open, and I know that they've been opening back up, whether it's a hybrid or just fully open. I also know some schools that opened had to shut down because of the COVID outbreak, too. But what I want to get at here is providing opportunity to get into a system school, whether it's Madison or River Falls or wherever, doesn't start, in somebody's senior year of high school. We have to invest in K-12 education as best as we possibly can to make sure that when it comes time, there is a seat for them in a school that they want to go to here in Wisconsin. And we haven't been investing, I think, as much as we could, or as well as we should be, certainly in K-12, because that's where it all starts. So if we want to up the numbers of students going into our university system, students of color, it doesn't matter where they're coming from. We just need to make sure that there's equal opportunity in our K-12 education system, which there's not. We need to make sure that there's access to that opportunity in our K-12 schools, and there's not. Wi-Fi, for crying out loud. It's the great equalizer. And if students in our K-12 education system had access to Wi-Fi, that would open up more doors and more opportunities for them. But it just doesn't start, and I know you know this, it doesn't start toward the end of high school. In order to get the numbers where we would all love them to be, and make sure that if a student does want to go to the university, there is a place for them, it's got to start way back and make sure that we take care of K-12 education better than we are now.
So I've got some questions coming in from the audience, and this one is for Senator Kooyenga, and it's reflecting on some of your entry-level remarks, going back to those. And this audience member asks, if Senator Kooyenga would like to see the governor take out some of those lapses, what are those lapses, and why were they in there in the first place?
Yeah, so I mean, what a lapse is after the budget is passed, an appropriation represents the maximum that the executive branch can spend. It doesn't represent, in most scenarios, the exact amount that he will spend, right? You can spend up to this much. So what frequently happens is that the executive branch will subsequently, and in this case is because of nervousness, which was justified, absolutely justified, by the Evers administration, to say, we don't know economically what we're headed into. And so therefore, in order to protect state finances, I'm requiring a lapse of the University of Wisconsin system. It was a heavy lapse. Two lapses combined, we're talking about $85.8 million. Once again, I believe that Evers' actions on that were justified under the circumstances. We have since subsequently found out that the state revenue is actually in really good shape, in addition to our rainy day fund, in addition to a general fund balance, in addition to federal funds that can give us some assistance, not all of it, but on some of it. So my point now is the governor should reverse those lapses. So a lapse is when a governor says, hey, UW, we told you we're going to give you this much money and you could appropriate this much money. Time out, we need some of that money back. And so then what University of Wisconsin will do is actually at their discretion how they do that. And typically what they do is that they won't fill vacancies. So vacancies won't be filled. They may tell other concessions let's face it, most of the costs are payroll, right? So usually payrolls where you save cost. They may defer some expenses to future periods. So that's what a lapse is. A lapse is a cut, and that's what happened. And that's why I think it's time for Governor Evers to give UW that money back, because the state can afford it and UW can do good things with that money. Because I know Jason was saying like the legislature could do whatever they want, but like the legislature is a group of people with all different opinions, especially like within a party. Like I know I've heard about your Dem caucuses. They're not all exactly on the same page. And shocker, a Republican caucus isn't on the same page. So, that's where I'm just looking at as far as like seeing stuff that UW could do. It's like, okay, let's give them the $86 million now to take care of some of the stuff while we hash out what else we can do.
One other thing to remember about why the UW tends to get hit is you think about what state government spends money on. They spend money on aid to K-12 schools, aid to local government, Medicaid, healthcare for the needy, and prisons, and UW. I mean, those are the big things. So you think about it, you're in a crisis, which, in May of 2020, we were in a crisis. We are in a crisis, but we thought that the crisis effects on the state budget were going to be more severe than they turned out to be. Well, can you cut Medicaid? Not really without working with the federal government through waivers. And if you cut money from Medicaid, you lose a lot of federal matching dollars. So you don't want to do that. You don't really want to take money away from local schools that you told them. So you don't want to do that. Same with local governments. Well, can we cut prisons? Well, they're 24/7 institutions. They've got to be staffed. You take too many of those people out, you just got to pay overtime to other guards. So what often happens in state government, I've been around not too long, but long enough to have seen the movie a couple times. We turn to the university system, because you tend to try and cut payroll. Where is there payroll within state government? It's not actually that as many bureaucrats as you would think. It's the UW and prisons. And again, I told you about prisons, so you just turn to the UW. That's happened again and again. But as the senators, I think, have mentioned, there's a danger, I think, to returning to the same well over and over again without eventually replenishing it.
Question from one of our audience members about UW-Madison's ranking, in particular its ranking for receiving research funding from the federal government. So this questioner is suggesting that in the past, the university has ranked extraordinarily high in receiving these research funding awards, which has brought in a lot of dollars to the state. Yet UW-Madison's ranking has dropped in recent years. And the question is, are legislators concerned about that drop? And how does that interact with funding for higher education? Let's start with Senator Erpenbach this time.
Yeah, very concerned. And when concerned when the ranking dropped, I think it was a year or two ago. And frustrated because part of the reason why the ranking dropped a little bit isn't entirely on the legislature, but there were some pieces of legislation that made it difficult to research certain things on campus, for example. I talked about the micromanaging. When you introduced legislation to, trying to figure out how to politely say this, when legislation's introduced that interferes with a person's ability to marry who it is they want to marry or be with who they want to be with, they're going to leave. And along with that is going to be their research dollars. Those are going to leave. So we want great things to happen in our lifetime. We want a cure for cancer. We want all of these things to happen. And if we don't get the research dollars and the faculty and the researchers attached to those dollars, we're dying on the vine here. We have to continue to do what we can to put the UW in a very, very strong position when it comes to research and when it comes to faculty and attracting the best and the brightest and bringing their work here to campus. So again, the UW is good at that. The legislature is not good at that. And we need to kind of get out of the way and allow the UW to be what it was before, and a giant in worldwide in the field of research, whatever the subject might be.
I could speak that a little bit. We looked at this question in our research on the UW system. So between 2010 and 2018, research spending at the UW actually grew 17%. It's more than the rate of inflation, seems pretty good. The problem is that if you look at the top 30 universities in the country for R&D spending, we were like 27th in terms of what our increase was. So that meant that we fell from like third highest in the country to, I think it's 8th now. So again, we still top 10 institution. We rank favorably compared to institutions like Harvard. It's, we really, and in some ways as a state, won the lottery to have a public institution that is able to compete at that level, but it's not guaranteed that we will always be able to compete at that level. We have slipped. And if you look at UW-Milwaukee, which is our other sort of lower tier research institution, the story's even worse. So, on the one hand, I think we can feel very good about where we are still at as a state, but I think there is some reason for concern about what our future is without, again, thoughtful steps to ensure that we remain strong.
Yeah, it's a big deal. I mean, you can't water down that this is a big deal. And we need to make sure that University of Wisconsin, the whole system, particularly, when you talk about research dollars, you're primarily talking about UW-Madison, not to detract from the others, but dollar-wise, that's the big one. But I mean, it's a big deal. And we gotta, first of all, maintain policies that are unique to UW, that's put them in that position in the first place. So for example, UW is a very unique situation with intellectual property that is created by a professor that's owned by the professor, as opposed to by the university. We need to retain incentives like that, even though like the professor may not be compensated at the highest levels, they have these other carrots and sticks, be like, yeah, but you have this right, and we have things like WARF. And I think we got to depoliticize a lot of this stuff. I mean, I don't think that helps our, a lot of the grants. I mean, I think there is an element of that. But yeah, we got to stay competitive. I mean, I can't get too far ahead of where we're at, but I can tell you that I'm intimately involved with the Department of Defense right now, and some of the work they're doing around, water and environment, and trying to make some connections there that I think will pay some dividends in the future. So I wrap it up, is absolutely concerned, and the state of Wisconsin should, draft up a plan as far as like how we climb back up towards the top of that chart.
I think we have time for one more question, and we've had a couple of our audience members ask about Bucky's tuition promise in particular, which is present on UW-Madison's campus to help low-income Wisconsinites, and actually middle-income Wisconsinites, attend UW-Madison. And the question is around the expansion of that program to other system college entities, excuse me. And I'm wondering, first from Jason Stein, do programs like this exist at other institutions? And maybe set the stage for us, and then we'll ask our senators to reply for our final question.
Bucky's tuition promise guarantees. I think students below $60,000 a year will have a financial aid package that gets them through school. You see that in some other states. There are tuition promises in some other states. It's obviously something that the system and the governor have wanted to see expanded statewide. For a bit of context, if you look at HEAB, you look at financial aid within Wisconsin, the Wisconsin grants, things like that, that's really been flat over the past decade. And when we talk about things like wanting to bring new students into the system, non-traditional college students, and also send a message to them, I think as just somebody that is a communications person, the message I think that we send to the people of the state is as important or even more important than what the actual dollars are. It's, if you're, a student of color who's like 16 years old, like what sort of a sense do you have about your state, about whether or not they have your back and want to see you succeed and will be there for you? And so I think that's an enormous opportunity that lies there for the state. If it's, again, we don't advocate, I'm not advocating one way or the other, but just looking at the facts of it, I think that they tell an eloquent story.
Yeah, right here in Wisconsin, Milwaukee Area Technical College was ahead of the UW on this and got this together, and it's in place and it's operating very effectively. One thing to note on that, though, is that a lot of it was initially and continued to be funding privately through generous people in our state across the political spectrum that have a heart for our community and want to see people climb an economic ladder, and that's relevant throughout the UW system. So yeah, definitely support that. I mean, it came out with, going back to base and all the policy came out, but it's definitely something I would support going forward. And I think, to me, that type of program has a lot more sense to it than a blanket tuition freeze with a backfill. Let's target those that, are in a tight spot. I was in that tight spot. I mean, when I was in high school, my dad said, I'm a garbage man, your mom's a nurse, figure it out. I looked at my checkbook. My checkbook said I was going to community college. So I went to Moraine Valley Community College for 2 years. It was, and I went there because of affordability. And it was good to me. And I'm very glad for that route and the route it took me in life. But I've been there. I've been the kid in high school that figures out, like, how do I do this? And no one else in my family went to college ever, and had to figure it out. And so I have a heart for folks like that. They're trying to figure it out. And I think that program is along the lines that helps them figure it out.
Bottom line is it was taken out of the budget yesterday. That's the bottom line. You can argue that it came out because it wanted to get back to the base budget, but there are things that the governor agrees with and the Republicans agree with and the Democrats agree on that came out of the budget yesterday, and they didn't have to. And this is probably one of them. And the frustrating part about all this stuff is, according to the co-chairs of the Finance Committee, once something is taken out of the budget, we can't talk about it anymore, essentially. I'm still hoping that it finds its way somehow back into the budget. But the point is, it's something that I think a lot of people support. And if they do, really, truly do support it, why was it taken out? But it was taken out yesterday.
I think we'll end with a non-substantive question for Senator Kooyenga. What's the timing of this budget? When do you think it's going to pass? And when do you think we could expect this next biennium to kind of close out our conversations?
Yeah, speaking of timing, I'm going to answer this, and then I got to cut off for a 1 o'clock meeting. I think the timing will, we're all waiting for the May Treasury decision. I think that's part of it. Then early week in June, we get revenue numbers, which will really help indicate how much cash we have around. And that's a little bit different this year because of the delayed filing. The feds delayed their tax filing to May 15, 8 days from now, and the state followed that lead. So the revenues are trickling later than they usually are, estimate-wise. But I'm optimistic that the budget will wrap up in short order, be done by the end of June and voted on, and then hopefully it comes to agreement with the governor and signed into law. Fortunately, we live in a state where if the budget is not passed, the world doesn't come to an end. You can still enjoy your state parks. Everyone in the government is still paid. Constitution, I think, is one of the best parts of the Constitution is in Wisconsin. That's unique to us, is that it continues at base. We don't have government shutdowns. So, hey, thanks so much for having me. It's good to see you all. And please stay in touch in the future and on Wisconsin.
Thanks to
All
all.
right, if I can, while Dale's leaving, I can talk about him now. All right, so
I'm out.
here's where I disagree with my good buddy, Dale Kooyenga. We don't need to wait for Treasury. You got to remember that. The federal funding has nothing to do with the upcoming state budget. It doesn't. They're apples and oranges. So when you do contact your legislator, remind them of that. We're talking about one-time money, is going to be pretty restrictive, can only be spent on what Treasury says it can be spent on. And oh, by the way, it has nothing to do with the state budget that we're putting together.
Well, thank you to our two state senators and Jason Stein for adding the evidence. We love it. And thank you to all our audience members, as well as PROFS and ASPRO and the Follette School for sponsoring this event. It was really informative, and I really appreciate all of your time, panelists and staffers who worked behind the scenes. And I think, just like Senator Kooyenga said, on Wisconsin.
On Wisconsin, thank you.